The year is 1945. Britain stands victorious but broken. Cities lie in ruins. The economy is shattered. The workforce is decimated. And in this moment of desperate need, Britain turns to its empire with outstretched hands. "Come help rebuild the motherland," they said. "Britain needs you," they proclaimed. What they didn't say was, "But only until we don't need you anymore." Let's be brutally honest about what Britain was in 1945. A nation on its knees, begging for help. The war had claimed over 400,000 British lives. Industries were crying out for workers. The NHS, launched in 1948, was hemorrhaging staff before it even began. The London docks were silent. Factories stood empty. Hospital wards were closing for lack of nurses. Bus routes were suspended because there were no drivers. This wasn't the proud, imperial Britain of popular mythology. This was a desperate, broken country that had sacrificed everything for victory and now faced the humiliating reality that it couldn't function without help. British men had died in unprecedented numbers. British women, who had kept the home front running, were exhausted. The birth rate had plummeted during the war years, creating demographic gaps that would echo for decades. The invitation to Caribbean workers wasn't born from generosity, it was born from desperation. Britain needed bodies to fill jobs that British workers either couldn't or wouldn't do. The government knew this, the employers knew this, the trade unions, despite their public protests, knew this too, but acknowledging this truth would have shattered the comfortable fiction of British superiority that underpinned the entire imperial project. And so began one of history's most cynical recruitment drives. British officials travelled across the Caribbean, painting pictures of prosperity and belonging. They promised citizenship, opportunity, and a place in the mother country. They showed photographs of London's grand buildings, carefully avoiding the bombed-out shells that still littered the cityscape. They spoke of the NHS as a beacon of progress, omitting the fact that it was already failing for lack of staff. The propaganda was slick, professional, and fundamentally dishonest. Recruitment posters showed smiling black faces integrated seamlessly into British workplaces where, in reality, "No blacks" signs were commonplace. The colonial authorities worked hand in hand with British officials to present emigration as patriotic duty, a chance to serve the empire that had civilized them. When the Empire Windrush docked at Tilbury on June 22, 1948, carrying 1,027 passengers from the Caribbean, it wasn't just a ship arriving, it was Britain's salvation steaming into port. But even in that moment of desperate need, the reception was telling. There were no brass bands, no official welcomes, no red carpets. Instead, there was barely concealed panic about where to house these essential workers who had answered Britain's call for help. The government had invited them, but made no provisions for them. Many of the Windrush passengers spent their first nights in Britain in a deep-level air raid shelter at Clapham South underground, out of sight, as if their presence was somehow shameful despite being desperately needed. Over the next 2 decades, nearly 500,000 Caribbean workers would answer Britain's call. They filled the labour shortages in transport, healthcare, manufacturing, and public services that kept Britain functioning. But let's examine exactly what they were walking into and what they built with their hands, their sweat, and their unwavering determination to succeed despite systemic hostility. Here's what Britain's history books conveniently forget. Caribbean workers didn't just fill jobs, they powered the post-war economic boom that transformed Britain from a war-torn nation into a modern welfare state. Without Caribbean labour, Britain's post-war reconstruction would have been impossible. They were the backbone of the NHS from day one, keeping London's buses running and building the very infrastructure we celebrate today. London Transport alone recruited over 4,000 Jamaican workers in the 1950s, specifically targeting skilled mechanics and drivers. These weren't random immigrants seeking opportunities. They were hand-picked professionals recruited because British transport was on the verge of collapse. The red double-decker buses that became symbols of London were kept running by Caribbean hands. The underground system that moved millions of commuters daily relied on Caribbean engineers and maintenance workers. The NHS became so dependent on Caribbean nurses that recruitment drives became an annual pilgrimage to the islands. British hospitals sent teams to Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, competing with each other to attract the best nursing talent. These women, and they were predominantly women, had trained in world-class medical facilities in the Caribbean. Many held qualifications that exceeded those of their British counterparts, yet they were systematically paid less, promoted slower, and treated as second-class medical professionals. Manufacturing industries across the Midlands and North were revitalized by Caribbean workers who took on the dangerous, dirty, and difficult jobs that sustained Britain's industrial recovery. In Birmingham, Coventry, and Manchester, Caribbean men worked in foundries, textile mills, and engineering plants that formed the backbone of Britain's export economy. Their labor generated the foreign currency that Britain desperately needed to pay off its war debts and rebuild its international standing. But here's the kicker. While these workers were building Britain's prosperity, they were facing daily humiliation that would break lesser spirits. No Irish, no blacks, no dogs. Signs weren't rare curiosities, they were the norm. These signs appeared not just on boarding houses, but on pubs, shops, clubs, and even some workplaces that simultaneously relied on black labor during the day while excluding black customers after hours. Housing discrimination was systematic and brutal. Landlords routinely charged Caribbean tenants double or triple the rent paid by white tenants for substandard accommodations. Entire families were crammed into single rooms in crumbling Victorian houses that white families had abandoned. Local councils maintained unofficial but rigidly enforced quotas, limiting the number of black families in council housing, condemning generations to overcrowded, overpriced private rentals. Job discrimination was endemic and sophisticated. Caribbean workers found themselves systematically excluded from promotions, trapped in the lowest paid positions regardless of their qualifications or experience. Professional qualifications earned in the Caribbean were often dismissed as inferior, forcing doctors to work as hospital porters and teachers to work as bus conductors. This wasn't accidental, it was a deliberate system designed to extract maximum labor value while minimizing economic competition with white workers. The medical profession provides a particularly stark example of this exploitation. Caribbean doctors who had trained at world-renowned medical schools found their qualifications unrecognized in Britain. They were forced to repeat years of training, often while working menial jobs to survive. Meanwhile, the same hospitals that refused to recognize their qualifications were desperate for medical staff and relied heavily on Caribbean nurses and auxiliary workers to function. And when tensions boiled over, into violence, as in Notting Hill in 1958, who did the British establishment blame? Not the system that created ghettos and perpetuated inequality. They blamed the immigrants for causing trouble. The Notting Hill riots were sparked by sustained attacks on Caribbean residents by white mobs, yet press coverage consistently portrayed the Caribbean community as the aggressors and disruptors of social harmony. The police response was telling. While white youths rampage through Notting Hill, attacking black residents with bottles, knives, and iron bars, the majority of arrests were of Caribbean men defending their homes and families. The justice system that followed was equally biased, with black defendants receiving harsher sentences for defending themselves than white attackers received for initiating violence. Let's talk numbers that will make you angry. By 1971, Caribbean immigrants had contributed an estimated £400 million to Britain's economy. That's £5 billion in today's money. They paid taxes, national insurance, and pension contributions that funded Britain's welfare state expansion. This figure doesn't even account for the full value of their labor, which was systematically undervalued through discriminatory pay practices. More shocking still is the pension scandal that followed. Caribbean workers who had paid into Britain's pension system for decades found themselves excluded from full benefits by residency requirements introduced retrospectively. Many were told they needed to have been ordinarily resident in Britain for periods that predated their arrival, creating impossible bureaucratic obstacles to accessing benefits they had paid for throughout their working lives. The housing wealth gap that persists today can be traced directly to these discriminatory practices. While white families used post-war prosperity to buy homes that appreciated dramatically in value, Caribbean families were systematically excluded from home ownership through mortgage discrimination and residential segregation. Banks routinely refused mortgages to Caribbean applicants or offered them only for properties in the most deprived areas, creating cycles of disadvantage that persist across generations. Educational discrimination compounded these economic disadvantages. Caribbean children were disproportionately placed in schools for the educationally subnormal, not because of learning difficulties, but because of cultural bias in testing and systematic low expectations from teachers. Bright children were written off, their potential squandered by a system that saw black intellectual achievement as an anomaly rather than an expectation. Fast forward to 2012. Theresa May, then Home Secretary, announces the hostile environment policy, the stated aim: to make life so unbearable for illegal immigrants that they would voluntarily leave. But here's the truth they don't want you to know. This policy was designed with a particular target in mind. Not European overstayers or American visa violators, but the Caribbean community that had built modern Britain. The hostile environment wasn't colorblind. It specifically targeted people who looked and sounded like they might be immigrants, predominantly black and brown communities. The policy required employers, landlords, banks, and healthcare providers to act as immigration enforcement officers, checking documentation and reporting suspected illegal immigrants. In practice, this meant that anyone who didn't look or sound British enough faced constant scrutiny and suspicion. The mechanism was diabolical in its simplicity: demand documentation that the government itself had failed to maintain, destroy landing cards and records, then punish people for not having documents that were never properly issued or were deliberately destroyed. The Home Office had systematically destroyed thousands of landing cards and disembarkation records in 2009, eliminating the very evidence that could prove legal residence for the Windrush generation. This wasn't bureaucratic incompetence. It was deliberate policy designed to create an undocumented population that could be exploited and eventually expelled. Internal documents later revealed that the Home Office was fully aware that these destroyed records were the primary evidence of legal residence for thousands of Commonwealth citizens, yet they proceeded with destruction anyway. The results were catastrophic. At least 164 people were wrongly deported to countries they had left as children, torn from families, jobs, and communities they had known for decades. Thousands more were denied healthcare, lost jobs, couldn't access benefits, and were detained unlawfully. People who had lived in Britain for 50, 60, 70 years were suddenly told they were illegal immigrants. Anthony Bryan, who had lived in Britain for 50 years, was detained twice and told to prepare for deportation to Jamaica, a country he had left as an 8-year-old. Paulette Wilson, who had worked for the House of Commons and Parliament for years, was detained for a week and told she had no right to be in Britain, despite having lived there since she was 10 years old. These weren't isolated cases. They were the logical outcomes of a policy designed to terrorize and exclude. Healthcare became a weapon of enforcement. Hospitals were required to charge upfront fees to patients who couldn't prove their immigration status, leading to people avoiding life-saving treatment. Cancer patients had operations cancelled. Pregnant women were denied prenatal care. Diabetics rationed insulin because they feared seeking medical help. The NHS that had been built with Caribbean labour was now being used to enforce their exclusion. These weren't administrative errors, this was institutional racism, weaponized as government policy. The same departments that had recruited Caribbean workers in the 1940s and 1950s were now implementing policies designed to drive their descendants out of the country. Let's examine the staggering hypocrisy at the heart of this scandal. The same government that recruited Caribbean workers to save Britain's economy spent decades implementing policies designed to make their lives miserable. In the 1940s, come and help us rebuild. In the 2010s, get out or we'll destroy your life. This government invited our parents and grandparents here when they needed us. Now they're trying to throw us out because they think they don't need us anymore. It's racism, pure and simple. The invitation was never genuine. It was transactional. When the transaction no longer served British interests, the welcome was withdrawn with brutal efficiency. The compensation scheme that followed was a masterclass in bureaucratic cruelty. Years of delays, impossible evidence requirements, and insulting payment amounts for people whose lives were destroyed. Victims were required to provide documentation that the government had destroyed, prove losses that were often immeasurable, and navigate a system designed to minimize payouts rather than provide justice. Glenda Caesar, who lost her job as a teaching assistant after 34 years because she couldn't prove her right to work, received just £1,000 in compensation despite losing her career, her pension contributions, and her sense of belonging in the country she had called home since childhood. The government valued her destroyed life at less than the weekly salary of a junior civil servant. Total compensation paid so far, £75 million. Economic contribution of Windrush generation, incalculable billions. The mathematics of injustice couldn't be clearer. The compensation scheme was designed to limit liability rather than provide justice, with bureaucratic hurdles that ensured many deserving claimants would give up in frustration or die before receiving payment. Politicians lined up to express regret and promise lessons learned. Theresa May apologized, calling the treatment of the Windrush generation appalling. Amber Rudd resigned as Home Secretary, claiming she hadn't been aware of deportation targets that were documented in her own departmental reports. Sajid Javid replaced her, promising a complete change of culture at the Home Office. But here's what they won't tell you. The hostile environment policy remains largely intact. The institutional racism that created this scandal hasn't been dismantled. It's been rebranded. Immigration enforcement continues to target Black and brown communities disproportionately. The right to rent checks that led to housing discrimination against anyone who looks foreign remain in place. The NHS charging system that denied healthcare to long-term residents continues largely unchanged. The promised Windrush Lessons Learned review revealed systematic failings throughout the Home Office, documenting institutional ignorance and thoughtlessness towards the issue of race and the history of the Windrush generation. Yet most of its recommendations remain unimplemented years later. The culture of hostility that created the scandal persists because it serves the political interests of governments that benefit from scapegoating immigrants. So where does this leave us? With a nation built on immigrant labor that continues to scapegoat immigrants for its problems, with a political establishment that sees racism as a tool of governance rather than a moral failing, with a society that celebrates diversity in Olympic opening ceremonies while implementing policies designed to exclude and diminish the very communities being celebrated. When COVID-19 struck, who kept Britain alive? Immigrant nurses, immigrant doctors, immigrant care workers, many from the very communities that Britain had spent decades trying to exclude and diminish. The same NHS that had been weaponized against the Windrush generation was now utterly dependent on their children and grandchildren to function during the greatest health crisis in living memory. The statistics are stark. People from ethnic minority backgrounds made up 44% of NHS medical staff and 20% of NHS nurses during the pandemic, despite being just 14% of the population. They were overrepresented in the most dangerous frontline roles and suffered disproportionately high death rates from COVID exposure. Once again, Black and brown bodies were deemed essential for Britain's survival, while Black and brown voices remained marginalized in decision-making. We built the NHS. We kept the buses running. We paid our taxes. We earned our place. And they tried to throw us away like garbage. These aren't the words of ungrateful immigrants. These are the words of British citizens whose contributions have been systematically ignored, whose loyalty has been constantly questioned, and whose belonging has been perpetually conditional. The Windrush scandal wasn't an accident. It was the logical conclusion of decades of institutional racism masquerading as immigration policy. It revealed a fundamental truth about British society, that Black and brown contributions are welcomed in times of need, but discarded when convenient. This isn't just a story about immigration policy gone wrong. This is a story about a nation that built its modern prosperity on the backs of people it never truly accepted as equals. A nation that continues to profit from diversity while punishing the diverse. A country that demands integration while maintaining systems of segregation. that celebrates multiculturalism while implementing policies of exclusion. The Windrush generation saved Britain after the war. They rebuilt bombed cities, staffed empty hospitals, drove abandoned buses, and taught in understaffed schools. They paid the taxes that funded the welfare state, fought the discrimination that would have broken lesser spirits, and raised children who became doctors, teachers, engineers, and leaders despite systematic disadvantage. Their reward? Deportation threats, document demands, healthcare denial, and a compensation scheme designed to insult rather than restore. Their legacy? A Britain that remains structurally racist while congratulating itself on its tolerance and diversity. The question is, when will Britain save itself from the racism that created this scandal in the first place? When will it acknowledge that the Windrush scandal wasn't an aberration, but a revelation of truths that many would prefer to keep buried? When will it admit that the hostility wasn't an environment, it was a philosophy, a worldview that sees black and brown people as perpetually foreign, permanently suspicious, and ultimately dispensable? Until Britain confronts these uncomfortable truths, until it dismantles the systems that created and sustained this injustice, until it acknowledges that racism isn't a historical relic, but a contemporary reality, there will be more scandals, more betrayals, and more communities that discover that their contributions to British society come with terms and conditions that can be revoked without notice. The great betrayal continues because Britain has never truly reckoned with the contradiction at its heart. A nation built by immigrants that hates immigration. A multicultural society governed by monocultural institutions. A country that demands gratitude from people it has never learned to value as equals. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more documentaries like this. Thank you for watching.